The chandeliers above Zaria Adeyemi burned like small suns, indifferent to the people beneath them. She moved between bodies the way water moves between stones, precisely without being seen. Silver tray balanced at shoulder height, white gloves, hair pinned so tight it pulled at her temples. The catering uniform was 2 sizes too large, borrowed from a colleague who hadn't shown up, and the hem dragged slightly against the marble floor of the Sujin Grand Ballroom. She focused on the tray, on the glasses, on not spilling. She was 26 years old and had been surviving Seoul for 18 months, which meant she had learned to count every one, to smile at the right moments, and to make herself invisible in rooms where visibility was currency. Tonight's gala was charity in name. The kind of charity that costs 40,000 won per plate and benefits no one in a room with a ceiling that high. Zaria's mother had been a seamstress in Ibadan. Her hands were always moving, threading needles at midnight, hemming school uniforms for children who weren't hers, pressing fabric with a hot iron until the steam rose around her like something holy. Her father had been an investigative journalist. His hands were always still, resting on keyboards, folded on desks, patient before they struck. He had followed a trail of money that moved between Lagos and Seoul like a quiet hemorrhage, documented it carefully, and then vanished 8 months before Zaria graduated university. No body, no news cycle, just absence, sudden and total, like a word swallowed mid-sentence. She survived. That was what her mother said on the phone now on the nights she called. Survive. So Zaria had come to Seoul to find the trail herself. What she had found instead was debt, a shared room in Mapogu, and a catering job that paid cash. She lifted 2 empty glasses from a passing table, exchanged them for full ones, turned, and felt him before she saw him. The feeling was specific, the particular quality of stillness that means someone is watching you and not bothering to hide it. He was standing near the far pillar. Darius Vale. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in charcoal that probably cost more than her monthly rent, with a drink he hadn't touched held loosely in one hand. He was not looking around the room. He was looking at her. He was smiling. Not a greeting smile, not a surprised smile, the smile of a man who had known exactly where to stand. Her stomach dropped. She turned to change direction, and his hand closed around her wrist, not violent. That was what was terrible about it. His grip was easy, almost gentle, and yet the pressure was absolute. He pulled her a half step toward him and leaned close enough that she could smell his cologne over the champagne. "You changed your hair," he said softly. "I almost didn't. Let go of me." Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. Zaria. Just her name, just the weight of it in his mouth. She scanned the room, fast, practiced, and her eyes caught on a man standing slightly apart from the nearest cluster of guests. Korean, late 20s, dark suit, no tie, jaw set at an angle that suggested he had stopped listening to whoever was near him approximately 30 seconds ago. He was watching the exchange with something that wasn't quite curiosity and wasn't quite concern. She moved without thinking. She crossed the 3 meters between them in 4 steps, slid her free hand through his arm, and said, quietly, close to his ear, because Darius was still close, "Baby, there you are." The man went very still. She felt it through her palm on his arm, the sudden tension, the moment of calculation. His eyes dropped to her hand on his sleeve. Then they moved past her, to Darius, reading something in the distance, then back to her. His expression was the surface of a closed door. She started to pull her hand back. Too far. "He's going to—" He placed his own hand over hers, firmly, warmly, not possessive, but certain. "You're late," he said, and his voice was low and perfectly controlled, and he was not looking at her at all. He was looking past her at Darius, and his face had settled into something that Zaria could only describe as a warning that had learned to wear the shape of calm. Welcome to AfroKSoulTales, where love is never simple, power always has a price, and the deepest scars are often the ones no one sees. Here we tell unforgettable Afro-Korean romance stories, filled with tension, betrayal, healing, and the kind of emotions that stay with you long after the story ends. So, settle in, and let tonight's story pull you in. Darius did not move immediately. He studied the man who had just claimed Zaria with the same methodical patience he might use to read a contract. Something shifted behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or recalibration. He took a slow sip of his drink at last. Then he stepped back, unhurried, voluntary, but as the distance opened, he leaned forward slightly, just enough that only Zaria could hear, and said, "This doesn't change anything." Then he was gone, absorbed into the glittering current of the gala, becoming just another broad-shouldered silhouette among dozens. Beside her, the man watched him go, not nervously, not with relief, the way a chess player watches an opponent remove a piece from the board, waiting to understand why. "He's not angry," the man said quietly, almost to himself. Zaria looked up at the profile beside her, sharp jaw, the faint track of something careful in his expression. "No," she said, "he's never angry." The man finally looked at her. His eyes were very dark and gave nothing back. "Who is he?" She didn't answer immediately. In the middle distance, Darius had found a group of businessmen and was laughing at something. It looked entirely genuine. "Someone who doesn't lose quietly," she said. The balcony smelled of cold stone in the city below, exhaust, jasmine from a nearby planter, the faint salt of the Han River carried on the night wind. Zaria leaned against the rail and breathed it in slowly. The man, she still didn't know his name, stood a few feet away with his hands in his pockets. He had followed her out here without being asked, and she hadn't told him not to. She told him the minimum. Darius Vale. They had met in Lagos, where he had been brokering something she hadn't understood at the time. He had decided she was his. Not romantically. That was not quite the right word for what Darius felt. More like she was an object he had selected, and objects didn't renegotiate their position. She had run. He had followed. 3 cities in 11 months. He hadn't touched her. He didn't need to. He stood outside buildings. He sent things to her room. He made sure he knew exactly where she was at every hour, and he waited for the weight of it to press her back to him. She stopped talking. The man looked at her wrist, at the faint purple bloom beneath her glove where Darius's grip had been. He said nothing. She hadn't mentioned it. "Did he do that?" he asked. She didn't answer. He nodded once, slow, as if she had. Below them, through the tall glass doors, the gala continued its bright and oblivious circuit. "I'm Kang Taehyun," he said finally. She recognized the name. Sujin Group, the kind of wealth that appears in headlines without anyone ever quite explaining where it began. Zaria Adeyemi. He didn't offer a hand, neither did she. He proposed it the way someone tables a clause in a negotiation, flatly, without sentiment, watching her face for the precise moment she understood. A fake relationship. Public. Photographed. 3 months. He needed to neutralize a merger arrangement his family had constructed. A match with Han Yosa, daughter of Sujin's largest competitor, engineered by their respective fathers to consolidate assets and keep both families in alliance. Taehyun found it insulting in a way he didn't explain and hadn't been asked to. He only said that he needed it disrupted and that the disruption needed to look organic. Personal. Real enough to hold under pressure. She needed what he could provide. Security infrastructure. A driver. A new phone with a number Darius didn't have. A building with a door that required 4 forms of access. A reason for Darius to pause, reassess, recalculate. "No feelings," he said. "No expectations. Nothing real. We appear together in controlled settings. The contract covers the timeline, the terms, and the exit." She looked at him. He looked back. The city moved behind him through the glass. "You want a weapon," she said. "I want a solution," he said. "So do you." She said no. Not loudly, not emotionally. She said no the way she said most things. Simply, from somewhere behind her sternum, a refusal that had been made so many times it had become architectural. Taehyun said nothing for a moment. Then, "Men like him don't lose quietly." "You said that already." "You didn't answer it." She pressed her palms flat against the balcony rail and looked down at the street below, the cars moving in orderly streams, the small lit squares of other people's evenings. She felt tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. "I'm not currency," she said. "I'm not buying you," he said. "I'm proposing a mutual arrangement between 2 people who both need something the other can provide. You can walk out of it on your timeline. I'll honor that." Something moved below. She caught it before she understood what she was seeing. Darius, standing on the pavement outside the main entrance, looking up. Not at the balcony specifically, at the building. Still, patient, smiling. He wasn't even trying to be subtle. That was the part that always turned her blood cold. The indifference to concealment. The confidence of a man who had never once imagined consequences that applied to him. Beside her, Taehyun had followed her gaze down. He looked at Darius for a long moment without changing expression. "Think about it," he said, and went back inside. In a corridor below the ballroom, Darius stepped through a fire door and into the quieter air of a service stairwell. He typed a number from memory and waited. "Vale." The answer came immediately, a man accustomed to being called at odd hours. "I need a background file," Darius said. Kang Taehyun, financials, relationships, pressure points, board positions, family dynamics, anything outstanding. He paused. Find his weaknesses. He listened to the confirmation, then ended the call and stood for a moment in the industrial fluorescence of the stairwell. He examined the information he had. A name, a face, the protective posture of a man who had placed himself between Darius and something Darius had already decided was his. He was not angry. Anger was for people who weren't sure they would win. When Taehyun re-entered the ballroom, something had changed in his posture. Barely measurable, but Zaria, who had followed him back inside, caught it. He moved differently, with intent. He stopped at the center of the room at the precise gravitational point where the most number of people would naturally orient. He waited until the conversations nearest him had paused one by one, the way silence travels. Then he said, clearly and without theater, "I'd like you to meet my girlfriend." He looked back at Zaria. She stood very still. The room absorbed it, this thing he had said without asking her, and began to react. A ripple of recalibration, eyes moving between them, the air of Soojin Group and a woman in a borrowed catering uniform, and somehow he was saying this as if it required no explanation. Across the room, a woman in red, Han Yeosa, Zaria would learn her name later, had gone perfectly, dangerously quiet. Her expression didn't break, but her champagne glass tilted slightly, as if the hand holding it had briefly forgotten its task. Beside her, a man Zaria didn't recognize was watching the scene with an expression that had no warmth in it at all. Cold, still, measuring. That was Soojin Doyeon. She wouldn't know that either, not yet, and his stillness felt different from Taehyun's. Where Taehyun's stillness was controlled, Doyeon's felt like weather, something vast, waiting. The applause came in uncertain waves. Somewhere a photographer raised a camera on instinct, then lowered it, then raised it again. Taehyun held Zaria's gaze across the distance. His expression said, "This is the offer, made concrete. This is what I meant. This is the shape of it." She thought about the pavement below the balcony, the figure standing in the cold. She walked toward him. They spoke in a service corridor off the east wing, away from the photographers. Taehyun laid it out precisely. A car and driver, available every hour. A phone, clean and untraceable. An emergency line that would always be answered. A documented exit protocol if she ever felt the situation was unsafe. He didn't oversell it. That was what made it credible. He gave her the terms and then stopped talking and let her sit inside them. "You've done this before," she said. "Constructed arrangements?" "No." "Managed risk?" Something almost quiet moved in his expression. "Yes." Her car, a second-hand Hyundai she'd borrowed from a colleague, was in the lower parking level. She took the stairs alone. He was leaning against the driver's door, not waiting. Waiting implied uncertainty. Darius was simply present, the way a wall is present, immovable, unapologetic, already there when you arrive. "He's not what you think he is," Darius said pleasantly. "Move away from the car. You always come back." He said it with a kind of gentleness that was worse than anger because it came from somewhere he genuinely believed. "I don't understand why you make it harder than it needs to be." She kept her face still. She had learned that any expression she gave him became material, ammunition or confirmation. She gave him nothing. He stepped aside finally with a small gesture of invitation as if he were holding the door for a guest. She got in, started the engine, and didn't let her hands shake until she was 2 blocks away. Her building was in Mapo-gu, a narrow 7-story structure wedged between a laundromat and a shuttered convenience store. She parked on the street and sat for a moment. The car was there, black, unfamiliar, parked at the corner where the streetlight didn't reach fully. It had been there when she left 4 hours ago. It was still there now. She counted to 10, slowly. Then she got out, walked upstairs, and locked every lock, the deadbolt, the chain, the secondary bar she'd installed herself. In the order she always did, the sequence she'd learned by necessity, the ritual that was less about security than about the feeling of doing everything she could. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark. Then she took out the card Taehyun had placed in her hand as she left the ballroom. She looked at it for a long time. She turned it over, she put it down, she picked it up again, she called the number. The penthouse was on the 43rd floor of a building that had its own name, which meant it was the kind of building that operated like a small country. The elevator required a card and a code. The lobby required a second code. The corridor outside the penthouse door was monitored by 3 cameras she counted without trying to. She signed the contract at a low glass table while Taehyun stood at the window with his back to her, looking out at the city spread below in its grid of orange and white. The document was 4 pages. She read every word. 3 months. Public appearances only. No access to personal or private matters. Either party could terminate with 2 weeks written notice under specified conditions. A non-disclosure agreement attached as addendum. She signed. He turned from the window, glanced at the papers, and picked them up. He didn't say welcome or thank you or anything that would soften the transaction into something it wasn't. "There's a room," he said. "If you need it, you don't have to move in." "I won't," she said. He nodded once. Hanyosa had people. That was what money bought, ultimately. People who were good at finding information and motivated to bring it to you without being asked twice. By morning, she had Zaria Adeyemi's immigration record, her employment history, and the address in Mapogu. She sat with the file open on her desk and read it 3 times, looking for the angle, the thing that explained why Taehyun, careful, controlled Taehyun who did nothing without a strategy, had stood in the middle of the Sujin Grand Ballroom and said girlfriend. She found no obvious answer. That was the thing that concerned her most. The stylist's name was Min Jae, and he had worked for the Sujin family for 11 years, which had apparently taught him that his proximity to wealth was a form of it. "She'll want to cover the arms," he said to Taehyun, while Zaria was standing 3 feet away. "The coloring makes it a challenge, but we can—" Taehyun said, "You're dismissed." Silence. "I'm sorry?" "You're dismissed. Today and going forward." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't repeat himself. He just looked at Min Jae with the patient expectancy of someone who understands that the statement has already been made and requires only compliance, not emphasis. Min Jae left. Zaria watched Taehyun. He was already moving to the next item on the day's agenda, already lifting his phone, already somewhere else in the architecture of his attention. He didn't acknowledge what had just happened or invite her to thank him for it. That, she thought, was more honest than if he had. She filed it away, the fact of it, the texture of it, under something she hadn't named yet. The restaurant was in Gangnam, the kind of place where the menu had no prices and the water arrived in a specific sequence. They sat across from each other beneath a low amber light, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, which was unexpected and therefore slightly uncomfortable. She ordered in Korean. He noticed. He didn't comment. The cameras were there. 2 photographers from separate outlets, both pretending to be dining, positioned near the entrance and the interior corridor. Taehyun had arranged it. This was the controlled setting he had promised. Visible without being spectacle. At one point, she reached across the table for the water pitcher, and her sleeve pulled back slightly, and the bruise on her wrist was briefly visible beneath the light. She pulled the sleeve back down without looking at him. He had seen it. She knew he had seen it. He said nothing. He said nothing for several seconds, and then he said, "Tell me something true about you. Not for the arrangement, just tell me something." She was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say that silence was louder than any accusation," she said. "I thought he meant it metaphorically until I understood what he was investigating." Taehyun looked at her steadily. "What happened to him?" "He disappeared." He didn't offer condolences. He didn't perform sympathy. He held her answer as if it had weight, which it did, and he held it carefully, which she noticed. The meal ended. They left separately in the same car, without touching. The arrangement arrived at the penthouse the following morning. White lilies, wrong for the season, wrapped in black paper, left outside the front door of the 43rd floor. The head of building security brought them up personally. He set them on the entry table and said very carefully, "Whoever sent these, they knew your floor. Not the building, the floor." Taehyun stood in the entry, looking at the flowers. Zaria moved forward and pulled the black paper aside. No note. Inside the wrapping, where a card should have been, a bracelet. Brass, thin, broken at the clasp. She recognized it. She had lost it in Lagos. In the apartment, she had fled 18 months ago, in the dark, with 40 minutes to pack and a taxi she had paid for in advance. She had not gone back for it. She had assumed it was gone. Her hand closed around the broken bracelet, and the metal was cold against her palm, and she stood very still, because Darius had been inside that apartment, and he had kept it, and now he had sent it here to this address on this floor. Not as a threat exactly, as a reminder. I was always closer than you thought. I always knew. I have been patient with you, and my patience is a choice I can revoke. Taehyun was watching her face. She looked up at him. Her expression had closed down to something flat and controlled, but her jaw was set and her hand was shaking slightly around the cold brass in her palm. "He's been inside my past," she said quietly. "Now he's inside your building." Taehyun looked at the door, at the hallway beyond it, at the cameras in the corridor, cameras that had apparently missed something, or been bypassed, or been helped. When he turned back to her, something had changed in his expression. Not fear, the opposite of fear. A cold focusing, the compression of something large into something precise and contained. "Then we changed the terms," he said. "The contract?" "I'm not talking about the contract." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. The penthouse kitchen smelled of coffee she hadn't made. Zaria stood in the doorway in the borrowed robe she'd found folded on the guest room chair. Taehyun's doing, left without comment, and watched him standing at the counter with his back to her, reading something on his phone. He was already dressed. The city behind the floor-to-ceiling windows was still gray with early light, the Han River a silver stroke below the haze. He didn't turn around. "There's rice, and eggs if you want them." She sat at the island. He set a cup of coffee in front of her without being asked, without looking up from his phone, and returned to reading. It should have felt clinical. It did feel clinical. And yet, the quiet between them had a particular quality. Not the aggressive silence of two people avoiding each other, but the quieter kind of two people who had not yet learned what to do with the fact that they were here. She wrapped both hands around the cup. The brass bracelet was on the counter beside her keys. She hadn't been able to put it away yet. He glanced at it once, said nothing. "Routine," she told herself. "This is just routine." She was not convinced. The Sujin Group quarterly brief was scheduled before Taehyun had thought to mention it, which meant Zaria learned about it when the car pulled up to a building with 6 cameras already trained on the entrance. She had dressed for a working morning, not a public one. She got out of the car anyway. The questions started before they reached the doors. A cluster of journalists with recorders extended, all of them speaking Korean, most of them speaking too fast, some of them switching to English specifically for her benefit, which was its own particular kind of sharpness. "Is it serious? Where did you meet? How long has this been going on? Can you comment on reports that this relationship is affecting the Sujin-Han merger discussions?" She kept her expression neutral and let Taehyun answer, which he did, briefly, precisely, giving them enough to print and nothing worth analyzing. But then, one journalist, a man in the back with a recorder and the self-satisfied energy of someone holding something, said, given her background, catering staff, no established ties to the industry, "Do you think the Sujin board would consider this a liability?" Taehyun stopped walking. He turned back. Full turn. Deliberate. He looked at the journalist with the calm attention of someone who had just decided something. "Her background," Taehyun said, "is not a board agenda item, and your access to future Sujin briefings is now under review." He turned away again. "Next question." The cameras continued. Zaria kept walking. She didn't thank him. He hadn't done it for thanks, but something in her chest had shifted, slightly, like furniture moved a few inches from where it had always been. Imperceptible from a distance, significant from where she stood. The headline appeared at noon. Sujin Heir's mystery girlfriend, who is Zaria Adeyemi? The subhead was worse. It was always the subhead. Sources close to the family raised questions about gold-digging claims, immigration status, and background checks that reportedly returned nothing of note. The story had her immigration record, her catering employer, a photograph taken at the gala, clearly from inside the event, that showed her in the uniform with the tray still in her hands. The caption read, "Working the room in more ways than one." She read it standing in the penthouse. Then she put her phone face down on the table. She had been humiliated before. She knew the specific mechanics of it, the way it arrived not as a blow, but as a slow evacuation of dignity, the world rearranging itself around you until your presence in it felt contingent, provisional. She breathed through it. Her father's voice from somewhere in her memory, "They publish. You survive. Then you find out who gave them the file." She picked her phone back up. He already knew by the time Zaria showed him. He had an alert on his name. Of course he did. He made 3 phone calls in the time it took her to read the article twice. She heard them from the other room. Measured, quiet, surgical. No raised voice, no repetition. By the afternoon, Han Yosa's access to the Sujin-Han merger preparatory documents had been suspended pending a review of information security. The framing was legal, not personal. It was precisely that, the impersonality of it, that made it devastating. Taehyun came back into the room and said, "She won't do that again." Zaria looked at him. "You can't control everything she does." "No." He paused. "But I can control what it costs her." It was the right answer and the wrong kind of answer, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. So she nodded and looked away first. It was past 2 in the morning when she woke. Not from a dream exactly, from the compressed aftermath of one, the residue of something she could no longer see but could still feel pressing at the back of her sternum. Her breath was wrong. Too fast, too shallow, the room suddenly too small and the walls too close and the dark too absolute. She sat up, put her feet on the floor. Counted the locks. She didn't know she'd made a sound until the light under the door changed. Taehyun knocked once and waited. She didn't answer. He waited again. "Zaria," she said. "I'm fine." Her voice came out wrong. A pause. Then, "I'm going to open the door." He did. He stood in the frame, dressed still. Or dressed again, she couldn't tell. And he looked at her sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands pressed flat on her knees and her jaw tight and her breath audibly uneven. And he crossed the room and crouched in front of her. Not close enough to touch. Just present. "Look at me," he said quietly. She looked at him. "You're in the building," he said. "The floor is real. The door is locked. I'm here." He said it without sentiment, without performance, like a man reading coordinates. "This is where you are. Here are the facts of it." Something in her breathing began to slow. He stayed. He didn't move. Didn't speak again, just maintained the quiet weight of being there until her hands unclenched and the room had recovered its proper proportions. Then he stood, moved to the chair in the corner, and sat. "I'll stay until you sleep," he said. "Don't argue about it." She didn't. Sujin Doyun arrived on a Tuesday with no scheduled notice and a bottle of wine he set on the table as if he owned it, which, technically, by family share, he partially did. He was Taehyun's cousin, Zaria learned, which explained the resemblance. Same jaw, same economy of movement, but nothing about Taehyun translated cleanly to Doyun. Where Taehyun's coldness felt like discipline, Doyun's felt structural, built in. He was charming at the table. That was what made it feel like an interrogation. "Your father was a journalist?" he said at one point, pouring wine for himself. "In Nigeria. What did he write about?" "Investigative pieces," she said. "What kind?" "Corruption." Doyun smiled pleasantly. "Interesting work. For a journalist." He lifted his glass. "Did it pay well?" "Well enough," she said. "And yet." He glanced around the penthouse, a gesture that managed to encompass everything about her presence in it without saying anything directly. "Here you are." Taehyun at the head of the table said, "Doyun." Just the name. A warning, with no edge showing. Doyun didn't stop smiling. "I'm asking perfectly reasonable questions. She's going to be in family photographs. People will want to know who she is." He looked at Zaria with the patient attention of someone who is not actually interested in the answer, only in the effect of the question. "Do you know who you are? In this context, I mean. What you bring to it." Zaria set her fork down. "I know exactly what I bring to it," she said. "The same way I know what this conversation is." A beat. Something shifted in Doyun's expression. Not respect exactly, but the recognition that adjusts a calculation. He lifted his glass toward her, said nothing else on the subject. When he left, the air in the room felt different. Wrung out. Taehyun stood at the window again, the city again, his back again. "He does that to everyone," he said. "Does it work?" A long pause. "Usually." Later, outside. The city below was quieter than it looked, sound swallowed by height, lights moving in their silent patterns. She leaned on the rail. He stood beside her at a distance that was neither close nor far, the length of a careful decision. "Why did you really propose the arrangement?" she said. "The merger excuse. I believe it. But that's not all of it." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "I know what ownership looks like," he said finally. "When someone has decided another person belongs to them, I recognized it." She looked at him, his profile, the city light catching the angle of his jaw. "That's specific knowledge," she said. "Yes." He didn't turn. "It is." He said nothing else. She didn't push, but she filed it. Filed it carefully, alongside everything else she had filed about him, under the growing architecture of what Kang Taehyun had survived that he hadn't told her. She had stayed on the balcony. He had come back out for reasons neither of them examined too closely. He stood beside her, and at some point the conversation had softened, not in content but in texture, until they were speaking quietly about small things, real things, the kind of conversation that happens when two people have stopped performing for the evening. She said something about Abadan in the rainy season, about the specific smell of the red earth after a downpour, and she didn't notice the way she turned toward him as she said it, until she realized he had gone still. He raised his hand, slow, deliberate. The back of his fingers moved toward her cheek, barely, the approach of touch, before touch arrives. He stopped. His hand dropped. He stepped back precisely and looked out at the city, and something in his jaw had tightened in a way that looked like a man reminding himself of the rules he'd set. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. The space between them pulsed with something that had no name in the contract. The call came at 7 in the morning. Building security, Mapogu, her old apartment. He'd been found in the building, not inside her former unit, which was already re-rented, but in the corridor outside, with photographs of the door, of the window. The security camera footage showed him arriving, moving with the calm ease of a man who had planned and leaving with something inside his jacket. The new tenant reported a small thing missing from the communal hallway. A mail slip, a forwarding notice, something administrative. But Zaria, when she heard the report, went very quiet. She knew what he'd taken. There had been a document she'd filed for safekeeping with the building's front office, a forwarding address form, which listed the name of the contact she reported to. The one person in Seoul who knew what her father had been investigating. Darius now had that name. Taehyun watched her face absorb this. "Tell me what he took," he said. She looked at him. "Not yet," she said quietly. It was the first time she had kept something from him, and she knew it, and she could see from his expression that he knew it too, and the knowing sat between them like a new kind of complication. She hadn't meant for him to see it. She'd reached for something on a high shelf in the kitchen, the sleeve pulling back, and there it was. Pale against her forearm, old and settled, a scar that had the clean geometry of something deliberate rather than accidental. He didn't look away. He didn't pretend he hadn't seen. "How old?" he asked, and his voice was very level. 22. She pulled her sleeve down. It wasn't what you think. He didn't use a weapon. He used furniture. I hit the edge of something on the way down." The silence after that was long and specific. "How many times?" Taehyun said, and the question was barely a question, the way you ask something when the answer is going to cost you. "Does it matter?" "Yes," he said simply. She looked at him, at the stillness in him that was different from his usual stillness, not controlled this time, restrained, like something beneath it that had no safe direction. "It matters," he said again, quieter, "to me." He told her that night. He hadn't planned to. She could see that. The way it arrived without architecture, without the careful arrangement of words he usually employed, the sentences coming out slightly wrong in their order as if the story had been stored somewhere too small. He had a sister. Had. Yuna. 3 years younger, quiet, the kind of person who made rooms feel warmer without trying. She had been in a relationship for 2 years with a man their father had approved of. Business family. Correct lineage, all the right surface qualities. Taehyun had been in Singapore, abroad on business. He had called her twice a week. She had always said she was fine. She had not been fine. By the time anyone understood what was happening, by the time the fine had eroded into evidence that could no longer be dismissed, Yuna had been hospitalized twice, and the man had been quietly relocated by his family to a different city, and the Sujin family had been advised by several people that a public incident would damage the merger discussions then underway. Yuna died 14 months after she married him. A fall. The official report said accidental. Taehyun had not been in the same city. He had been told after. He stopped talking. The room was very quiet. Zaria did not offer comfort because she understood instinctively that he was not looking for it, that what he had just offered her was not grief-seeking consolation, but architecture, the framework beneath everything, the thing that explained the shape of him. She understood now why he had recognized what Darius was. She understood why he had not pulled away at the gala. She sat across from him and let the silence do what silence does when two people have stopped needing to perform for each other. It rained the next evening. Real rain, the kind that turns Seoul's lights into watercolor. Streaks of orange and white blurred against the glass. They were both in the main room. Not by design, she was reading. He was not reading the thing he was holding. At some point, she became aware that he had not turned a page in 20 minutes. She looked up. He was looking at the rain. His profile was quiet in the way that meant something was working in him that he hadn't named. She crossed the room slowly, stood beside him at the glass. He didn't move. She was close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. He was close enough that his breath shifted when she arrived. Neither of them adjusted the distance. His forehead tilted toward hers, not touching, the suggestion of it, the space of a held breath between them. Her phone rang. She answered it before she understood why. Reflex, the need for interruption, because the alternative was arriving somewhere she hadn't consented to yet. It was the contact she reported to about her father. His voice was sharp. Something had happened. She stepped away from the window. Taehyun stayed where he was looking at the rain. Han Yosa was not a person who wasted resources on emotion. She was, however, a person who understood leverage, specifically the kind that doesn't announce itself. She found the file through Doyun, who had found it through channels she didn't ask about. An investigative document. Partial, fragmented, assembled over several years by a journalist named Zaria Adeyemi. It concerned a network of financial instruments that moved between Lagos and Seoul in the early 2000s, channeled through a subsidiary of the Kang Group, which had, in 2014, merged with Sujin. She read it 3 times, then she read the name on the file again. Adeyemi. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and understood, finally, why Taehyun had said girlfriend in the middle of the Sujin Grand Ballroom. He had recognized the name. Not in the moment, or not only in the moment, he had known the name, had done something with that knowledge, had made a decision she hadn't been consulted on. She picked up the file. Weapon acquired. The 3 months were over in 6 days. Neither of them had mentioned it. That in itself was a kind of answer, but to a question neither of them had asked aloud, which meant the answer had no safe landing place. He came to find her in the guest room where she was packing slowly, folding things with unnecessary care. He stood in the doorway. "You don't have to," he started. "I know I don't have to," she said. "The situation with Darius isn't resolved." "I know that too." He leaned against the frame. She could feel him working toward something, could sense it, the way you sense pressure changing before weather arrives. He didn't get there. "I'll have the driver ready," he said finally. She nodded and kept folding, and he stayed in the doorway for a moment longer than was necessary, and then he was gone. And the room felt the way rooms do when something has just been swallowed rather than said. Yosa called Zaria from an unknown number, which Zaria answered because she was already on edge and unfamiliar numbers felt lately like warnings she couldn't afford to miss. "Your father's name," Yosa said without greeting. Zaria Adeyemi. Taehyun knew it. Before the gala, he had a file flagged on the name in connection with old Kang corruption research. The same research your father was compiling. Zaria was standing in the lobby of Taehyun's building, bags at her feet. "The gala wasn't random," Yosa continued. "His security team had your employment confirmed 2 weeks prior. He knew who you were when he pulled you in." The lobby was very bright, very clean. "I'm telling you this," Yosa said, "not because I like you, but because you deserve to make decisions with the truth." The line went dead. Zaria stood in the lobby for a long time. She went back upstairs. He was at his desk when she came in. He looked up. Something in her face told him before she spoke. She could see him calculating it, the closed-off expression already assembling, the controlled self he put on when he expected a conversation he couldn't strategize his way through. "Did you know my father's name before the gala?" she said. Not a question, a sentence delivered flat as a floor. He was quiet. "Taehyun." "Yes," he set his pen down. "Not completely. I had a flagged name in a research file. I recognized it when your credentials came through security." and you said nothing. I intended to explain it once the arrangement was... Once the arrangement was what? Her voice was steady. That was the terrible part. How steady she kept it. Useful enough that it didn't matter? That's not what... You built a contract with me, she said, on a foundation you kept from me, on purpose. He stood. The intention was never to... I don't care about the intention. She picked up her bag from the floor where she'd set it. I care that you knew, that you saw me in that room and you recognized my name and you made a calculation, and you decided the calculation was more important than the truth. She looked at him across the desk. When did it stop being a calculation? He opened his mouth. Nothing came. And that, the silence where the answer should have been, the visible moment of a man who had arrived at something real too late to defend it with words, was worse than any lie would have been. She walked out. He didn't follow. The door didn't slam. It closed quietly, which was the worst sound of all. She found a room in Dongdaemun through a listing that accepted cash. 3rd floor, no elevator, a window that looked out onto a wall. She paid 2 weeks up front and sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark for a long time without unpacking. Then she changed her number. She had done this before. The room, the cash, the number, the particular quality of stillness that follows when you have successfully made yourself invisible again. She had done it in Lagos, in Nairobi, in 2 cities whose names she didn't say aloud anymore because saying them felt like directions. She knew she was repeating a pattern. She knew Darius knew the pattern too. She changed the number anyway because the alternative was staying somewhere that felt like it mattered, and feeling like it mattered had just cost her something she hadn't known she was carrying until she lost it. She put the brass bracelet in the bottom of her bag. She did not throw it away. The file came from his own legal team, or rather, from the part of his legal team that had been quietly investigating the Kang subsidiary for several months. He had commissioned it before the gala. He had not commissioned it for Zaria. He read it at his desk at 2 a.m, alone, with all the lights on, the way he kept them when sleep had become impractical. Emmanuel Adeyemi had not disappeared. He had been silenced, methodically. The documentation was partial, assembled from 3 separate forensic accounting investigations across 2 countries, but the pattern was clear. The money had moved through a Kang subsidiary into a real estate structure in Seoul, and the journalist who had documented that movement had been identified as a threat, and the threat had been managed. Attached at the back of the file was a transcription, 3 pages, single-spaced, recovered from a private server in Incheon. An audio recording, date stamped 2014, of a man in a room somewhere asking, not shouting, not demanding, asking in a voice that had already understood the answer, that the files be passed to his editor, that someone confirm they had been received, that his daughter, if anything happened, be told that the work mattered. His daughter. Taehyun read the transcription twice. Then he set it face down on the desk because looking at it a 3rd time was not something he was willing to do at 2 a.m. alone. The managing party on the order was a name he recognized immediately. Dohyun. And beneath Dohyun's name as principal, Chairman Sujin, his father. He sat with this for a long time. He thought about what he had known, the flagged name, the fragments, and understood that he had been given just enough information to feel strategic and not enough to understand what he was standing inside. He had been protecting a legacy built on a man who had died asking for his work to survive. He closed the file. He did not open it again. He sat with this for a long time. Outside, Seoul continued its quiet 3 a.m. business. He thought about what he had known, the fragments he had been given, the file he had flagged, the name he had recognized, and he understood that he had known enough to act on and had not known enough to understand what he was acting inside of. He had thought he was disrupting a merger. He had been protecting a legacy built on a woman's father. He closed the file, opened it again. He was not a person who permitted himself extended moments of feeling, but this one arrived without permission and was specific enough to have edges. He had been wrong, not entirely, not with intent, but wrong in a way that mattered, and the distinction felt, at this moment, insufficient. He called Dohyun at 6 a.m. Dohyun answered on the 3rd ring, already composed, which told Taehyun he had been expecting the call. They met in Taehyun's office, not Dohyun's. That was the first signal. Dohyun sat across the desk with his wine-tasting composure and his unreadable face, and waited. Taehyun placed the file on the desk between them. "The Kang subsidiary," he said. "The Adeyemi documentation. The 2013 payment to a private firm in Incheon." He paused. Tell me you didn't know. Doyun looked at the file, then at Taehyun. I was 24, he said. Your father made decisions. I was told what to manage afterward. And you managed it? I protected the family. You silenced a journalist, Taehyun said, and his voice was very quiet, which was the most dangerous register it had. You allowed a man to be disappeared, and then you sat across from his daughter at my dinner table and asked her what she brings to this. The silence between them was a wall with nothing on the other side. Taehyun slid the file across the desk. This goes to the prosecutor's office this afternoon. You have until then to decide whether you cooperate or whether you become the whole story. Doyun looked at the file for a long moment. The family isn't what I thought it was, Taehyun said. So that argument doesn't hold anymore. Doyun took the file. He cooperated. He had tracked the pattern. That was what she hadn't accounted for, that he had watched her run before, enough times to understand the shape of it. Cash rooms, third floors, windows facing walls. He had cataloged her survival methods the way a collector catalogs acquisitions. She heard the footsteps in the corridor at 10 in the evening, and she knew the specific weight of them, the particular patience. He came through the door with a card he shouldn't have had, and a knife that he held loosely, the way someone holds a familiar tool. He was smiling. Dongdaemun, he said pleasantly. That's new. You usually go further. She backed toward the window. Calculated distances. You changed your number, he said. That was unkind. He moved into the room without hurry, setting his jacket on the chair beside the door, folding it neatly. I don't want to hurt you. I want you to understand something. Don't, she said. You were never free, he said simply. That's the thing you haven't accepted yet. Every city, every room, every number, I'm already there. He tilted his head. If I can't have you... He stopped. Let the rest of it sit in the air unspoken, which was worse than the sentence completed. She moved left. He moved with her, unhurried, and she understood that this was not a negotiation and had never been one. She reached for her phone. 2 words. He found me. She sent it to the one number she hadn't changed, the number she had kept without examining why, filed under a name she had not let herself say aloud since she walked out of the penthouse. Then Darius knocked the phone from her hand, and it skittered under the bed, and she heard it land, and she hoped the message had sent, and she did not look to check because looking away from him was a mistake she wasn't going to make. He came through the door 11 minutes later. Darius heard him on the stairs. He turned from Zaria with the unhurried pivot of a man who has decided the sequence of events and isn't concerned about interruptions. Taehyun came through the door and the room compressed immediately. Too small. 3 people. The knife already visible. Darius holding it with the practiced looseness of someone who had used one before. He lunged before Taehyun had fully crossed the threshold. The knife caught Taehyun across the left forearm, a clean slice that opened immediately, blood soaking through the sleeve. But the lunge carried Darius's full weight, and Taehyun wasn't braced for it, and they hit the wall together hard. Taehyun's head connecting with the plaster, the impact audible. Darius got a forearm across his throat and leaned in, and for several seconds, Taehyun was losing, visibly losing, legs unstable, the knife arm coming back around for a second angle. Zaria picked up the water glass from the windowsill and broke it across the back of Darius's head. Not hard enough to drop him, hard enough to startle. A half second of flinch, the pressure across Taehyun's throat releasing by a fraction. That was all Taehyun needed. He dropped his weight, got under the arm, drove forward with his shoulder, and used the wall as the third point in a leveraged triangle that brought Darius down in a controlled collapse that was less technique than desperation that had found a geometry. His forearm went across Darius's throat. His knee locked the knife hand to the floor. Blood from his arm fell in a slow, steady rhythm on the boards beside them. Darius was still smiling, even from the floor, even with Taehyun's weight on him. You don't know what she is, he said, pleasantly, from the ground. Taehyun said nothing. His jaw was locked and his eyes had gone somewhere past controlled, somewhere that Zaria, standing against the wall with the broken glass stem still in her hand and blood on her palm from where it had cut her, recognized as a place that had nothing left in it except completion. What brought him back was the sirens. Distant first, then growing, then outside. He heard them. Something returned. He sat back. His arm was bleeding seriously. He didn't look at it. The police came through the door 40 seconds later. From his jacket, his car, and the room he had rented 2 blocks away, police recovered 4 tracking devices registered to Zaria's movements across 3 years and 2 countries. Voice recordings gathered through a modified phone application. Documented proof of the Mapo-gu break-in matching his handprint to the hallway camera, the knife, and a folder of printed photographs that began in Lagos and ended 2 days ago. Prior abuse reports from 2 separate cities were confirmed and attached to the file. He was held pending trial. He did not stop smiling in his intake photograph. The sentence, handed down 6 months later, was 8 years. No parole consideration for the first 5. Taehyun met with Doyun one final time. Same building, same office, 2 weeks after the prosecutor's investigation had formally opened. Doyun had cooperated, as promised. He sat across the desk with the posture of a man who had done the calculation and accepted its outcome. "Your father didn't know everything," Doyun said. It was the closest thing to a defense he had left. "He knew enough to benefit from it," Taehyun said. "That's the family you came from." "I know." Taehyun looked at him steadily. "You called it family. My father called it business. Her father called it evidence." He let that sit. Only one of them was right about what it actually was. Doyun said nothing. Something moved behind his eyes. Not remorse, which was not in his architecture, but the particular stillness of a man who has heard a sentence he cannot argue with and has sufficient intelligence to know it. "The family," he started. "Isn't what I thought it was," Taehyun said. "So that argument doesn't hold anymore." Doyun took the file from the desk. He cooperated. Taehyun left the building and did not look back at it. The Kang corruption story broke across 3 outlets simultaneously. The Sujin name appeared in the 4th paragraph. Compensation proceedings were filed within a week, a legal structure that acknowledged, formally and on record, that Emmanuel Adeyemi's investigation had been disrupted by parties connected to the merger entity. The statement was careful and lawyered and did not use the words killed or silenced, but it did not need to. The documents did that. Chairman Sujin stepped back from the board. The announcement used the word voluntarily. Taehyun said nothing publicly. He did not need to. The file had spoken and would continue speaking in proceedings that would outlast the news cycle by several years. She found him at the memorial site on a Wednesday afternoon. Not a cemetery, but a small garden space in Mapo-gu where a community advocacy group had placed a stone for journalists lost to hostile action. A recent addition. She had submitted the name herself. She was standing in front of it when she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. She knew the weight of them. He stopped a few feet back. His left arm was still bandaged, visible below the sleeve he hadn't fully pulled down. He looked worse than he had in the hospital. More accurately, he looked like a man who had slept very little and had not been taking care to conceal it. She looked at him for a long moment. "I didn't know what my family had done," he said. Not defense, just placement of a fact where it belonged. "I knew the name. I knew the file. I didn't know what the file connected to. I should have told you the name from the beginning. I didn't because I was still thinking about what it meant to me. That was wrong." She looked at the stone. Her father's name in both English and Korean, the translation something she had chosen carefully. Witness, a word that carried its weight in both languages. "He would have found the irony funny," she said, "that the money trail led to the family of the man who—" She stopped, breathed. He had a very specific sense of humor. Taehyun stood beside her and looked at the stone. Neither of them spoke for a while. The garden was quiet. Somewhere, a bird, the particular softness of afternoon light on stone. "I'm sorry," he said. Not to her, to the name on the stone, to the man who had documented the truth and paid for it. She heard it land where he meant it. He didn't ask anything. He offered nothing, promised nothing, built no framework. He simply stood beside her in the garden until she turned to look at him, and he looked back with the face he had stopped managing, the one beneath the strategy and the control and the careful distance, the one that had appeared in fragments during a panic attack in the dark, during a story about a sister who died, during a moment at a rain-streaked window. She had a new number, a new room, options she had not yet foreclosed. She reached out and took his hand. Not urgently, not dramatically, the simple fact of it. Her hand around his fingers adjusting to hold it, the quiet that followed as if the gesture had been waited for patiently enough to arrive at its own pace. He raised his free hand slowly, and she let him, and he pressed his forehead to hers. Not a kiss, not a claim, just the full weight of 2 people who have survived something arriving at the same coordinates. They stood like that for a long time. The city moved around them. The light shifted. Neither of them moved first. The Sujin Grand Ballroom looked exactly the same. Chandeliers burning like small suns, indifferent to the people beneath them. The same marble floor, the same current of formal conversation, the same careful deployment of jewelry and silence and ambition. Zaria stood at the edge of it in a dress she had chosen herself, and the room looked both larger and smaller than she remembered, the way places do when you return to them after they have meant something. She heard him before she saw him. "You're late." She turned. He was standing exactly where he had been that first night, near the pillar with a drink in hand, except this time he was looking at her without calculation, without assessment, without the careful blankness he used to maintain on strangers. "You waited?" she said. "Yes." Simply, as if it required no explanation. He crossed the distance between them and stopped an arm's length away. His left hand, she noticed, still carried the faint ridge of the scar from the knife. He hadn't hidden it. "I don't have terms," he said. "No contract, no timeline, no exit clause, just you and what's true and whatever you want to build from it." He held her gaze, the same eyes that had been cold enough to refuse her and dangerous enough to frighten her and wounded enough to make her stay. This time, no contract. The room moved around them. Somewhere, a glass chimed. She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had gotten it wrong and then gotten it right, who had stood beside her at a grave without excuses, who had bled on a floor 11 minutes after receiving 2 words on a screen and not stopped to calculate the cost. "Yes," she said. He reached into his jacket pocket and held out his hand. A ring. Unceremonious, direct, no box. Just the thing itself. Offered plainly, the way he said everything that mattered. She took it. The chandeliers burned on, indifferent, but the people beneath them were not. Thank you for spending your time with AfroKSoulTales. If this story moved you, leave a like. It helps stories like this reach more hearts. Subscribe for more unforgettable tales of love, betrayal, power, and healing. And tell me in the comments, would you have trusted Taehyun? Until the next story.